Some time ago, I met a locksmith who lives not too far from me in Durham, and he told me the following story. He said that when he was just a practicing locksmith, he was not very good. He said it would take him a long time to get into people's locks. And often because he was not that good, he also had to break the lock. So after a long time of trying to fiddle with it, he would break the lock, then he would replace it. And he charged people for the standard fee of opening the door. He would charge them for the lock, and people paid him happily and gave him a tip. He said after 2 years, he got really good at it. And now that he's really good, it takes him minutes to open a lock. He said he never breaks it, so he charges people less, just a standard fee for opening a door. And now he says nobody gives him a tip anymore, and everybody argues with him. Now, here's the situation. Which one would you prefer from a utility perspective? Which situation would you prefer? When somebody takes an hour to open your door, or when somebody takes 2 minutes? Of course, the 2 minutes is better, because if it's 2 minutes, you only have to stand outside for 2 minutes. You're in your house, somebody goes away, you don't have to worry. But how would you feel about paying that person? If you see somebody struggling and working and sweating outside of your house for an hour, you probably feel much, much better about paying them more and even giving them a tip. There's this mediocre joke that said that somebody drives a car to the mechanic and he said, oh, you know, my car is not running very well. There's a noise from the engine. I'm not sure what it is. So the mechanic says, open the hood. The person opens the hood. The mechanic looks at it, takes a hammer, bangs on a particular pipe. Boom, the car is driving perfectly. The noise is gone. And the mechanic says, that will be $100. The person says, $100 for banging with a hammer on a pipe? And the mechanic said, no. The banging is $1. Knowing where to bang is $99. Now, it's not a really funny joke, but the idea is that it's hard for us to pay for expertise. Right? Somebody could be an incredibly good locksmith, but we just don't feel good about paying for that expertise. But if we see somebody sweating and working for a long time, all of a sudden we feel better about the whole thing. We did a couple of experiments on this topic, and one of them, we asked people how much they would pay us to recover information from their hard drives. And we asked them to think about losing 1 day of information, 1 week of information, 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, a year of data. So lots of different amounts of data they lost. And you know what? People in general were willing to pay more money for more data recovery. That's good news. But you know what people really cared about? Was how long the technician worked on it. If the technician worked for 5 minutes to recover the data, they were not willing to pay so much. If the technician was working for a day, much more. For a week, much more. So in a sense, what we're doing is we're paying for incompetence. The longer people take to work on something, the more we feel we're willing to pay for them. And when somebody is high skilled and we don't see it, we're not willing to pay for this. By the way, fairness is also the big problem with the internet. Think about big organization, the New York Times. What do we think is fair to pay? Do we know anything about their size? Of course not. Or think about something else. In the old days, when you used to come to a teller, and you would write a check and they would give you cash, and you saw somebody, you're willing to pay something for this privilege. You saw that there was a person across the window from you, you saw that they were doing something, you were doing something, you took some of their time, it was perfectly okay to pay them for their time. But now, when it's an ATM, you just put your card in and money comes out, you don't see that you cost anybody anything. And because of that, people feel really outraged by having to pay these fees. Now, what this also tells us is that fairness in many ways is about marginal cost, not about fixed cost. If an organization paid lots of money to create something, and now every additional unit of delivery is free, as we think about it in the internet, we don't feel fairness needs to pay for it. But if the fixed cost is low and all of the cost is marginal cost, now we think there's a need for us to pay for it. So again, imagine the New York Times. Imagine that technology was such that the investment in the infrastructure was very low, but every time you would read the newspaper, you would cost the New York Times $1. Now you would feel very bad about reading the New York Times free without paying for it. But if it's a fixed cost, they pay lots of money to create it, but the marginal cost is zero, the notion of fairness is not coming along at all. So there's kind of a couple of interesting points here. One is that we do want to express to people the amount of hard work. If you're the locksmith, you want to show your hard work. If you're the New York Times, you might want to show people your hard work. If you're the mechanic, you might want to show people their hard work. But on top of that, there's also the question of how much of your effort is fixed cost and marginal cost. And when fixed cost is concerned, it's incredibly harder to get people to care, to feel people any kind of need for reciprocation because of fairness, any need to pay for this. The final story I want to tell you about fairness is the following. There was a plan in the Coca-Cola factories in Brazil to start charging for Coke depending on the temperature outside. And they basically had this Coke vending machine, and it was supposed to change the price of Coke based on the time of the day and the temperature outside. And if you think about it, it's a perfect mechanism. Why? Because as the temperature goes up, the joy from Coke goes up and you should be willing to pay more. But what happened? People were outraged. They were so outraged that the person who envisioned this idea had to resign from Coke. And why were people outraged? Because they did not see any increase in cost as a function of the temperature. Right? Fairness is not about how much money you can charge me. Fairness is about the relationship between how much something is costing you and how much I'm willing to pay, costing in terms of money, in terms of time, and so on. And because of that, people were outraged, and they had all kinds of ideas. They said, what if when I got close to the machine, it would scan my eyes, and it will identify exactly how thirsty I am, and it will set the cost exactly in a way that will be a cent below my maximum willingness to pay. And people were outraged with that. By the way, it's the ideal economic vision, right? You price people exactly like that, but people were outraged. Now, imagine the following, and you can just imagine that. What would happen if Coke said, we are not just charging you more because we can, we're charging you more because we have to spend more electricity. It's more expensive for us as the temperature goes up to cool the vending machine, to keep the Coke in a cold temperature, and therefore we're paying you more for that. Now it would not be perceived as Coke is just gouging you depending on your temperature. It would be an argument for fairness, basically saying these are pass-through costs. It's not us charging you. And you know, we're all willing to pay that. For example, we're willing to pay more for some beer in a hotel that we're willing to pay for beer in a grocery store because we know hotels have higher cost. Airlines, by the way, sometimes increase their prices and calling these prices, rather than price increase, they call them taxes. By the way, if you look at different airlines, you would see that different airlines for the same routes have very different taxes. Why do they have different taxes? Because taxes are not considered part of the price. They're basically saying the government is charging us that. Of course, the government is not charging different airlines different amounts, but some airlines are taking the amount of increase, they're calling it taxes, and then to us as consumer, it looks like pass-through cost, and we don't blame the airlines for it. So if you think about fairness, the main point is that when we are buying something, we should think about what are we getting and how much does it cost us. And if something is giving us more pleasure than the cost, we should buy it. And if something is giving us less pleasure than the cost, we should not buy it. The problem is it's really hard for us to figure out what something is worthwhile and how much pleasure it's giving us. So we're using all kinds of other techniques, all kinds of other heuristics and strategies. Fairness is one of them. And fairness is not asking how much pleasure am I getting from something. It's saying how much work and effort has gone into this thing. And if it's been more effort, I'm willing to pay more for it. And it's less effort, I'm willing to pay less for it. And depending on the industry you're in and the industry you're going to go into, expressing effort is either a benefit, or it's either easy for you to do or hard for you to do. It's something you should do more, or you should try at least to think about how to do it. So think about fairness. It's an amazing, important idea. And if we could only understand it better, I think we could get people to make very different decisions. One other interesting story about fairness is the following. Imagine you're at the beach with a very good friend of yours. It's a wonderful day. The temperature is great. The ocean is fantastic. And your friend tells you that they're going to get some beer, and do you want some? And you say, yes, I want some. And your friend said, look, I'm going to go and get beer, but I don't know how much it will cost. So tell me what's the maximum amount that you will pay. If they'll charge more than that, I would not get the beer. If they charge less, I'll pay for it, and then you'll give me back the money, whatever they charge. Okay. So now your task is to say, what is the maximum amount of money you're willing to pay for beer? And the friend is either telling you they're going to a hotel or they're going to a grocery store. What will happen? people give a much higher amount to the hotel than to the grocery store. Why? Does the joy of drinking beer on the beach changes depending on where the beer came from? Of course not. If it were, there would be trucks of beer going through lobbies of hotels just to increase the quality of the beer. The beer is the same, but what happens is that your notion of fairness enters into the process. You're not just thinking to yourself, how much am I going to enjoy sitting on the beach here and drinking beer? You're saying also, what is a fair price? And if the beer comes from a hotel, your fairness includes the cost of running a hotel, and your willingness to pay goes up with it. So if you think about all these stories about fairness, what they really tell us is that our understanding of how much we're willing to pay for something should, in principle, comes from how much value we're getting from it. We're getting more value, we should be willing to pay more. We're getting less value, we should be willing to pay less. But the reality is that directly assessing how valuable something is, how much do we enjoy beer, how much we're enjoying getting our doors open, our computers recovered, Coke, all of those things are incredibly hard, so we're using shortcuts. And one of those shortcuts is to say, how much effort has been created for me to consume that? And if the effort is higher, willing to pay more, and if the effort is lower, willing to pay less. And it means that as consumers, you probably want to think about effort a little less. If you think of it as a biasing tool that gets you to pay too much or too little based on the effort, you want to try and overcome it. And as producer, you might want to say, how do I signal effort? How do I tell people how much effort went into it? Because effort is the main mechanism, or one of the main mechanisms, by which people are going to decide how much to pay for something. And as we move into the internet economy, effort is harder and harder to think about. Fairness is harder and harder to think about it. More things are becoming about high fixed costs and low marginal cost. Most things are hidden. We don't see what goes into them. How many hours go into creating a piece of software, for example, or an app. And all of this creating new challenges for effort, the expression of effort, because of that fairness and because of that willingness to pay.